ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।
ਆਓ ਜੀ। My newest book, my third Sikh history book, which I'm actually leaving. I'm leaving for India in a few days to launch. yak arz guftam peshto, yak arz guftam peshto, dargos pun kartare, hakat veer kareem tu बेब परवर yak arz guftam peshto, दुनिया मुकाम फानी तहकीक दिलदानी ममसर मुए अजराइल गिरफ्ते दिल है चना दानी दुनिया मुकाम फानी तहकीक दिलदानी
human being in that you're an IT consultant. We are in the woods in Boston, in your town called
Hopkinton,
where you've lived for 24 years. And from an IT consultant, you became a writer, a producer, a director of plays. You taught music, you played music. So you're a Renaissance man. What one thing do you want to tell us that you would like to share that you recently acquired? Because we're full of wisdom, aren't we? All of us wise about something. But sometimes when a wisdom just touches you because it happened yesterday, it's more describable. Can you think of something you want to share with us?
I started my life in technology, and I worked in technology development for several years, and then managed various businesses, large and small. And there's a lot of serendipity in life, and I would say that what I've been doing for the past decade or so, it's largely because of my daughter. She was a freshman at Smith College at that time studying theater, and she wanted to create something new. And she decided to take a long poem that I had written about the 1984 Delhi massacre, which had literally been written, 30 years ago. She had grown up with it because sometimes, at remembrance events, I would recite a few verses from the poem. It's a story of 4 children who survived the massacre.
This is the Delhi 84.
Yes, the Delhi 84 massacre after the assassination of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi. So my daughter decided to take this poem and turn it into a play. And this was in 2012. So she cast some of her old high school friends, amateur actors, and we did a performance in this town. It was very well received, it was powerful. And then that was that. A couple of years passed. And then I was in touch with the Sikh Research Institute, and there was going to be an academic conference in Ottawa, the first ever academic conference about 1984. So we figured, perhaps we should recast this with professional actors and take the play to the conference in Ottawa. So we started with very modest goals. We got a little bit of funding from the Sikh Research Institute. So we went to Ottawa, presented it. It was very moving because, after all, this is not ancient history. Invariably, every show that we gave had survivors or people who had relatives who were survivors. So we performed in Toronto, we performed in New York, New Jersey, and we figured we were done. And then one of my friends who lives in Cambridge, who came to our house for a reception.
Cambridge, USA or
No,
UK?
Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard and MIT are. So he said, ਕੰਮ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਚੰਗਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਜੇ ਕੁਝ ਕਰਨਾ ਹੈ ਨਾ, ਤੈਨੂੰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਓ.
You've done well, but you have to take this play to
Absolutely. So that was an interesting thought. It was also very appropriate. It also seemed very risky because India is, of course, a democracy, but it's a kind of democracy where certain things are not taken very well. So, we were apprehensive. Would questions be raised? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to incite people towards violence or revenge? But the idea stuck in my head. And I made a quick trip to India to get my parents, who were unwell, and I was bringing them to live with me here. I went and met Dr. Uma Chakravarti, who's a retired professor at Delhi University. She's probably one of India's best-known feminists, and she had done some incredible work in the aftermath of the massacre, documenting case histories, talking very fearlessly about what had happened. And it took her roughly a nanosecond to say, yes, you must bring this to India. So I started raising some funding, and we took the play to India, and we performed it in every major metro. And I would say that I was pleasantly surprised to find that the reaction of audiences, of course in Punjab and Delhi we expected a very emotional reaction. In Amritsar we got it. The interesting thing for me was the reaction in Bangalore, Chennai, Calcutta, where the audiences were overwhelmingly non-Sikh, was exactly the same. Shock, empathy, tears. What that told me was that the empathy of the common man in India is alive and well. Forget about the powers that be, but human beings are human beings, and I actually felt a little ashamed for being apprehensive because the reception was so wonderful. It went on, we had very modest goals, but by the time we were done, we had visited 6 countries, presented this 92 times, presented this inside British Parliament, and then my personal epiphany happened during the Birmingham performance, when a young Sikh boy, probably 17 or 18, came up to me after the performance and said, Uncle ji, मैं तो सोच नहीं सी सकदा कि साडी गल भी इंज कीती जा सकदी है.
That he was surprised that our pain, the community's pain, could actually be expressed so.
Or to put it even more broadly, our stories can be told in this manner. So that was my epiphany. I ended up, spending 2.5 years of my life doing Kultar's Mime. Every show was free, but I had to pay my actors. I had to fly them around the world, house them, feed them. So a lot of fundraising for 2.5 years. And when we were done with the play, mostly motivated by the kinds of sentiments I'd heard in the Birmingham show from that young man, I decided that I was going to dedicate the rest of my life to storytelling.
Wow.
And that's what I want to talk about. Why is it important to tell our own stories ourselves? So that's really the thrust of my work, a lot of which is, of course, within the Gurmat context and the context of Sikh history. But more recently, I find myself also being very drawn to broader Punjabi culture, Punjabi poetry, Sufi poetry in particular. And what has become very precious to me personally is the composite culture of Punjab. The pan-Hindu, Sikh, Muslim culture, which is really embodied in the Sufi poetry that I have been immersed in for the past few years. So my initial work was very rooted in Sikh history. So after the Kultar's Mime journey, when I decided to essentially become a storyteller, 2 years later I published my first book. It's called The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia. This was a collection of short stories that examined the violence of 1984 from many different angles. From a Sikh perspective, from a non-Sikh perspective. This was also very well received in India, especially by non-Sikhs as well, who felt that the stories of 1984 needed to be told. And, terrible things happen to Sikhs is of course an important, sort of theme in the book. But what happened in 1984 was so much more. There are stories of non-Sikhs who put their livelihoods and their families at risk to save Sikh lives. A few years ago, prompted by a young undergraduate student from one of the colleges in Maine, who had taken a course on Sikhism with Dr. Nikki Guninder Kaur, she visited me at the Gurdwara Sahib, and we started chatting, and she loved podcasts, I love podcasts, and this kid tells me, wouldn't it be nice if there was a podcast about the Sikh faith? And I said, yes, that sounds like a very good idea. And she asked me, can you recommend one? I said, well, I really can't think of anything off the top of my head, but maybe I'll do one. So that's when I started the Story of the Sikhs podcast. So this is a retelling of Sikh history. The first 2 seasons focused on the 10 Guru Sahiban. And these are not for people with short attention spans. The episodes are 45 minutes long, an hour long, sometimes 2 hours long. So an in-depth dive into our faith, which largely is from a very personal perspective, and it tries to encapsulate what I learned as a young man. Because when I arrived in this country as a young man, I was completely adrift from my moorings. And fortunately, I was inspired by a few people and felt that I needed to look for those moorings. So what I learned during that journey is what I put in the podcast. So the first 2 seasons focused on the Guru Sahiban. And one of the important things that I did, there are many books on Sikh history and many podcasts on Sikh history. My emphasis has very much been on using, quote, our own sources. So for Guru Nanak Sahib, of course, we have the Janam Sakhi accounts, in particular the Puratan Janam Sakhi. And then moving forward, I savored the writing of Mahakavi Santokh Singh's Gurpratap Suraj Granth. And then as we get into the Guru Har Gobind Sahib period and the Guru Gobind Singh Ji period, the Gurbilas literature, which is all Braj poetry, I found that to be personally inspiring, and of course I used traditional references and cited them, but a lot of my writing in my podcast drew from these Braj Bhasha sources, and I translated large sections of poetry from these sources to make them accessible to a new generation. So those were the first 2 seasons. The 3rd season then focused on the very turbulent period between 1708, when Guru Gobind Singh Ji left the world, and 1780, when Ranjit Singh was born. So everyone talks about the greatness of the Sikh Empire, and of course it was great, but there's not a lot of emphasis on those turbulent years, which were really the crucible in which the Sikh character was forged. So historically it was a very interesting time. The Mughal Empire was collapsing, the Afghans were attacking repeatedly, and that created a power vacuum in Punjab that the Sikhs slowly rose and started to fill. So that was my 3rd season. And then the 4th season that I'm working on right now is the rise and fall of the Sikh Empire. So to kind of pull all of this together, I am very motivated by, the 3rd season, which talked about this period, is heavily informed by Ratan Singh Pangu's Prachin Pant Prakash and Gyani Gyan Singh's Naveen Pant Prakash. Again, magnificent texts. I'm not an academic. So I don't have to hold myself to the standards of people who write history books.
Or peers.
I am moved by the romance that you find in Ratan Singh Pangu, the stirring tales, the beautiful rhetoric, and it's very sad to me that a whole generation of Sikhs is never going to read them, because who reads Braj poetry anymore?
Exactly my point, Sarbpreet Singh ji. So now, with the little few minutes we have left,
Yes.
there are people out there who might have tuned in and want to know what is it that Sarbpreet brings to us, and the fact that people have very little time. What, in a nutshell, for people who don't know any of the names you mentioned, from Ratan Singh Pangu to, well, I hope they know who's Maharaja Ranjit Singh, what one thing can you say to encourage these people to go beyond their 2 minutes of videos? How can they, or can you entice them now? Say something that you gained from that knowledge.
This is going to sound very self-serving,
It will.
but I have to tell you that the reaction of young Sikhs in the diaspora to my podcast has been phenomenal. I can, offline, I'll share with you some of the things that these very young people have written, people who were completely disconnected from their roots. People write about tears, people write about personal transformation. So, there are no magic pills. Puriya pouches koi nahi hage. I don't have anything that I can serve saying, here's your 2-minute inspiration for Sikh history. Unfortunately, we all have to do some work. I think that with my podcast in particular, I have made this history very accessible, particularly to English-speaking young people in the diaspora, who certainly have a desire to engage with this. And I think that there are many other initiatives. You can find lovely content, both in terms of podcasts, in terms of YouTube videos. So there are a lot of creators who recognize this need, and I'm sure just as I've had a wonderful response, many of these initiatives are also getting wonderful responses. So the good news is that there's a lot of curiosity, there's a lot of desire to learn, and I think that in terms of what we need to do, we need to have content that is accessible, and we shouldn't be afraid of challenging our listeners. We don't have to make 20-second TikToks to engage their attention. My podcast is listened to in 90 countries and has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. Young people listen to the episodes for an hour and a half. They were the ones who reached out to me and said, we want this in book form. So that resulted in the Story of the Sikh series, which has been published by Penguin. So the second volume in the series just came out, and I'm actively writing the third one. So all the translations that appear in the podcasts, they are all now available in print form as well. So I came to this country in my mid-20s, the product of, quote, elite education in India, growing up in Sikkim, as far removed from Punjab and Punjabi culture and the language as you can be, and completely convinced that anything that had anything to do remotely with Punjab was culturally inferior. And, Sikh culture was not even a thing. It didn't even exist in my head. So it was quite a transpersonal transformation for me. I was in the Midwest at that time. I'd started my first job in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in my local community, I met a bunch of young Sikhs who started introducing me to Gurmat Sangeet. And quite by accident, at the same time, I started developing an interest in North Indian classical music as well. So this interest became a lifelong passion. Gurmat Sangeet is something that draws you in, and was I drawn in? It really became an important part of my life. And after moving to Massachusetts, I started a non-profit called the Gurmat Sangeet Project. So I had collected, fairly large volume of traditional recordings of Kirtan by some of the greats who had passed on, like Tevran Singh Zakhmi and others. So I created a website for serving these to the Sangha. And in a couple of years, people all over the world started listening to it, and something miraculous started happening. parcels of cassettes would show up at my house. From New York, from Canada, people saying, you know, ek khazana panta hai. You know, this treasure belongs to the entire community. Digitize it and share it. So the Gurmat Sangeet project started doing this, I think it was right around 2004 or so. And then we branched out and started organizing events all over the US. We would invite a lot of young kirtaniye, really emphasize the playing of traditional stringed instruments like dilruba and taus. And then started inviting one senior kirtaniya to have them interact with the younger kirtaniye.
So you played an instrument, or was it?
I
vocals?
just play the harmonium. I mean, I'm not a great musician, but these days I just sing with a tanpura. I don't even use a harmonium. My daughter plays the dilruba and taus, and a lot of children here learned how to play those instruments as well.
On this note,
Yeah.
I'm going to use the pun of the word note.
Yeah.
I think I've illustrated why I use the word Renaissance man on you. What can you say in one line to people out there who says, well, I didn't have any idea what I would end up doing, and you've inspired them to think they could do something totally different from what they were trained to do. What's the one word you would use to describe yourself that brought you from that position of being an IT consultant somewhere to a person who lives, and if our camera could show us, the salubrious environment in which you
I would say the word would be passion.
passion?
If you have passion, then you can pretty much do just about anything.
What is your one favorite tuk of Gurbani that you rely on?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one. That's a very difficult one. But I'll tell you that one of my favorite shabads in Gurbani is the first shabad under Rag Tilang, Farsi da shabad hai, Yak Arz Guftam. So that I have an indescribable connection to Rag Tilang and that particular shabad.
Vaheguru
Ji
Ji
ka
ka
Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji ki Fateh.